There is a moment that comes to every person who is serious about their life. Not a dramatic moment, not a cinematic one. No thunder, no revelation descending from the sky. Just a quiet, ordinary moment, usually alone, usually at an unremarkable hour where something inside you goes still, where the noise stops just long enough. And in that gap between the noise, you hear something you have been running from for longer than you can remember. Yourself. Not the version you perform for other people, not the version shaped by what your family expected, or what your circle approved of, or what the world decided was acceptable. The unedited version, the one underneath all of it, raw, honest, still becoming. And in that moment, you face a choice that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. Do you run back to the noise, back to the distraction, the crowd, the comfortable blur of constant stimulation? Or do you stay? Do you sit in that silence, in that solitude, and let it do what it came to do? This is not a video about being antisocial. It is not about closing yourself off from the world or treating other people as threats. It is about something far more demanding than that. It is about the one discipline that makes every other discipline possible: mastering yourself. And the truth that nobody tells you, the truth that costs people decades before they discover it, is that you cannot master yourself in a crowd. You cannot hear your own voice when 100 other voices are louder. You cannot build a foundation in the middle of a storm. You have to go inward first. You have to be willing to be alone with what you find there. You have to stay in that solitude long enough for it to stop feeling like punishment and start feeling like power. That is what we are walking through today. Not 7 easy steps, not a checklist, a path. One that requires honesty, patience, and the willingness to look at yourself without flinching. 1. The noise was never random. It was a choice. We did not drift into distraction by accident. We chose it. Every time the silence got uncomfortable, we reached for something to fill it. A phone, a conversation, a commitment we did not need, a relationship we maintained not because it nourished us, but because emptiness without it felt worse than the slow drain of it. We built entire architectures of busyness around the single purpose of not having to sit with ourselves. And for a while, it worked. The noise covered the questions. The crowd covered the loneliness. The constant motion covered the stillness we were terrified to enter. But here is what we did not understand while we were doing it. The questions did not disappear because we stopped asking them. They went underground. They became the low hum beneath everything. The restlessness that would not explain itself. The dissatisfaction that followed us from one achievement to the next. The sense, persistent and impossible to shake, that we were moving but not arriving anywhere that mattered. Marcus Aurelius understood this with a precision that cuts through centuries. He wrote to himself in a private journal never intended to be read these words: "Go into yourself as much as you can." A man who commanded an empire, who sat at the center of the most powerful political machine the ancient world had ever produced, who was surrounded by advisors and armies and the endless noise of governance. And his instruction to himself, repeated across years of private reflection, was to go inward, not outward, inward, because he understood what most of us are still learning. The external world cannot give you what the internal world has not yet built. No amount of achievement, recognition, or belonging can fill the space left by a self you have never truly examined. The noise was a choice. and choosing differently begins the moment you recognize it as one. So we start here, with the willingness to acknowledge that the busyness was not productivity, that the crowd was not connection, that the constant motion was not progress, it was avoidance. And avoidance, however comfortable it feels in the moment, is the slow death of everything you are genuinely capable of becoming. The first step on this path is not dramatic. It does not require you to quit your job or move to a monastery or cut everyone out of your life. It requires something smaller and harder than all of that. It requires you to stop running. Just stop. Sit down. Be still. Let the discomfort arrive. And instead of immediately reaching for something to drown it out, let it speak, because it is trying to tell you something. And what it is trying to tell you is more important than anything the noise has ever offered. 2. What solitude reveals, that the world conceals. Solitude is not a mood. It is not a preference or a personality trait or something only introverts can access. It is a practice, an ancient one, deliberately chosen and deliberately maintained by every person who has ever built something that lasted. And what it reveals is not comfortable. That is precisely why most people avoid it. In the company of others, we can manage our image. We can present the curated version, the capable, together, unbothered version. And as long as we stay in motion and stay surrounded, that version can pass as real. We can borrow confidence from the room. We can fill our uncertainty with other people's certainty. We can mistake the warmth of being liked for the deeper warmth of knowing ourselves. But alone, all of that dissolves. Alone, you cannot borrow anything. What is there is yours. The thoughts that surface are your thoughts. The fears that rise are your fears. The patterns you have been repeating, the way you respond to pressure, to rejection, to failure, to praise, all of it becomes visible in a way it simply cannot be when the crowd is present to distract you from it. Epictetus, who was born into slavery and spent years in conditions of genuine powerlessness, understood the revelatory nature of solitude with extraordinary clarity. He wrote, "It is impossible for a man to learn what he thinks he already knows." That sentence is the whole argument. When we are surrounded by noise and motion and the constant reinforcement of our existing beliefs, we never encounter the friction that genuine growth requires. We hear our ideas echoed back to us. We receive confirmation of our existing worldview. We stay comfortable and we call it contentment. But it is not contentment. It is stagnation dressed in a familiar costume. Solitude introduces the friction. It strips away the echo chamber and leaves you with the raw signal of your own unfiltered experience. And in that rawness, things become visible that were always there, but always covered. The resentment you have been carrying but calling rationality. The fear you have been calling pragmatism. The grief you have been calling indifference. The longing you have been calling ambition without ever asking what you are actually longing for. These things surface in solitude, not all at once, gradually, like objects emerging from fog as it clears. And the temptation, the powerful, almost overwhelming temptation, is to run back into the noise the moment they appear. We must not. We must stay. We must look at what surfaces without immediately trying to fix it, or explain it, or medicate it away. We must simply observe, because observation is the beginning of understanding, and understanding is the beginning of change, not the surface-level change of new habits and better routines, but the deep change of a person who has genuinely met themselves and decided with full clarity who they intend to become. Seneca wrote in one of his letters, "Retire into yourself as much as possible. Associate with those who will improve you. Welcome those who you yourself can improve. The process is mutual, for men learn while they teach." But notice what he says first. Retire into yourself, before the community, before the teaching and the learning and the mutual growth, before all of it. First, the inward turn, because everything that follows, every relationship, every contribution, every act of genuine leadership or love or creativity is built on what you discover when you go there. 3. The destruction that emotion unchecked produces. Let us talk about the thing that solitude forces us to confront that we are most afraid of. Our own emotional interior, not emotions as the world understands them, not as weakness or strength, not as something to suppress or perform, but emotions as they actually are in an unexamined life, uncontrolled, reactive, running the show while we convince ourselves we are the one driving. We have all felt it. The rage that arrived before we could think. The shame that swallowed weeks of our life. The anxiety that made decisions for us before we were even aware a decision was being made. The jealousy we told ourselves was ambition. The despair we called realism. These are not experiences we are unfamiliar with. They are the landscape of a human life that has not yet been brought under the governance of a disciplined mind. And here is what the unexamined, emotionally reactive life costs. It costs you your relationships because people living at the mercy of their emotions create chaos for everyone around them, even when their intentions are good. It costs you your decisions because decisions made under the influence of unmanaged emotion almost never reflect your actual values. They reflect your momentary state. And it costs you your future because the accumulated weight of reactive choices over months and years creates a life that was never truly yours. A life built from impulse, dressed as intention. Epictetus identified this dynamic with a ruthlessness that still stings. Men are disturbed not by the things which happen, but by the opinions about things. Read that carefully. Not by the things which happen, by the opinions about them. The event arrives, neutral in itself, but the mind untrained, undisciplined, reactive, immediately assigns it meaning. Catastrophic meaning, threatening meaning, shaming meaning, and then acts from that assigned meaning as though it were fact. And almost always it is not fact. It is interpretation, colored by past wounds, by unexamined fears, by stories we have been telling ourselves so long we have forgotten they are stories. This is the work that solitude makes possible, not the suppression of emotion. The Stoics were never advocates for numbness. Seneca was one of the most emotionally alive writers in recorded history. Marcus Aurelius wrote about grief and loss and the fear of death with a tenderness that is genuinely moving. Epictetus spoke of love and connection and the beauty of human relationship. They were not cold, they were free. Free because they had done the work of examining what they felt before they acted from it. Because they had built the space, the crucial, life-changing space between what happened and how they responded. Viktor Frankl, who survived conditions that tested every limit of human endurance, described this space in words that carry the full weight of his experience. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. That space is not given to you. It is built through solitude, through repeated honest examination of your own interior, through the daily, unglamorous, unwitnessed practice of meeting your emotional reality with curiosity instead of surrender. And when that space is built, when you have enough distance between what you feel and what you do, something shifts fundamentally. You stop being a person who reacts. You become a person who responds. And the difference between those two things is the difference between a life you are living and a life that is living you. 4. The discipline of staying. When every instinct says run, this is where most people leave the path. Not because they lack intelligence, not because they lack desire, but because the demand of sustained solitude, the demand of continuing to examine yourself, honestly, day after day, without the reward of immediate transformation, is genuinely hard. It is hard in a way that is difficult to explain to someone who has not attempted it. Because the hardness is not dramatic. There is no single terrible moment you must endure. It is quieter than that, more persistent. The hardness of choosing, again and again, to sit in the discomfort rather than relieve it, to stay in the question rather than grasp at a comfortable answer, to keep looking at the parts of yourself that are not yet what you want them to be without either despairing about it or flinching away from it. Marcus Aurelius returned to this discipline every single day of his adult life. His meditations, written over years of the most demanding leadership imaginable during plague and war and political crisis, are essentially a daily record of a man refusing to let himself off the hook, refusing to allow comfort or busyness or the legitimate pressures of his position to become an excuse for abandoning the inner work. He wrote to himself, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." Not a thought he had once, a practice he returned to daily. Because the mind, left without consistent governance, drifts. It returns to its comfortable defaults. It reaches again for the noise. It begins to believe that the external circumstances are the problem, and that solving them will produce the inner peace that only inner work can actually build. The discipline of solitude is the discipline of returning to yourself, returning to the practice, returning to the honest examination even after the days you failed it, especially after the days you failed it. Because here is what the path of self-mastery actually looks like from the inside. It does not look like continuous ascent. It looks like a climb with frequent descents. Moments of genuine clarity, followed by moments of returning confusion. Days of emotional sovereignty, followed by days of being pulled back under by old patterns. And the defining quality of the person who actually masters themselves is not that they never fall. It is that the interval between falling and returning grows shorter, that the fall itself loses its power to destabilize, that they recover not because they are invulnerable, but because they have built something inside that keeps pointing back to center. Seneca understood this with the patience of someone who had failed and returned and failed and returned across an entire complicated lifetime. He wrote, "Begin at once to live and count each separate day as a separate life. Not the accumulated record of your past failures, not the daunting projection of how far you still have to go. Each day, a separate life. Each morning, a fresh encounter with the practice. Each moment of choosing solitude and honesty over comfort and distraction, a complete act in itself, regardless of what came before or after. This is how the discipline is maintained. not as a mountain you climb once and stand triumphant upon forever, but as a morning practice, a daily return, a consistent, quiet, unspectacular commitment to the inner life that eventually, over months and years, builds something that the outer world cannot shake. 5. What you find when you stop running from yourself. There comes a point on this path, and it comes differently for everyone, at different speeds, through different experiences, where the solitude stops feeling like discipline and starts feeling like home, where the silence that once felt threatening begins to feel like the most honest conversation you have ever had, where the questions you were afraid to ask yourself reveal answers that are not devastating but clarifying, where sitting alone with your own thoughts is no longer a confrontation but a communion. This is not a destination, it is a depth, and it deepens with practice. What you find there is not perfection. You do not discover that you are in fact without flaw or fear or contradiction. What you find is something more valuable than that. You find the bedrock, the part of yourself that exists beneath the performance, beneath the wound, beneath the accumulated layers of who the world told you to be. The part that, once found, gives you somewhere to stand that nothing external can remove from beneath you. Aristotle wrote, "Knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom, not the end, the beginning." Because what knowing yourself gives you is not answers, it gives you a stable platform from which to ask better questions, a center from which to engage with the world without losing your orientation, a foundation that holds when the external world, as it always eventually does, shifts. And from that foundation, something remarkable begins to happen in your relationships, your work, and your experience of daily life. You stop performing, not because you become indifferent to how you are received, but because you no longer need approval to feel real. You stop chasing the validation that used to feel essential because you have found, in solitude, something more reliable than anyone else's opinion of you, your own. You stop reacting, not because nothing moves you, but because what moves you no longer controls you. You feel everything, the anger, the grief, the fear, the joy, but you feel it from the inside of a self that is governed, that has enough space between stimulus and response to choose. You stop shrinking. The habit of making yourself smaller to fit into spaces, relationships, conversations that were not built for the full size of you, that habit dissolves. Not aggressively, quietly. You simply stop doing it, because you have spent enough time in solitude meeting your actual dimensions to find them no longer threatening. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his journal words he never intended for anyone else to read. Nowhere can man find a quieter or more untroubled retreat than in his own soul. He did not write this from a place of ease. He wrote it at the center of an empire in crisis. He wrote it surrounded by betrayal and plague, and the weight of decisions that cost human lives. And even there, especially there, the inward retreat was not an escape. It was a source, the place he returned to for the clarity that the external world could not provide. That is what you are building when you choose solitude over distraction, when you stay with the silence instead of filling it, when you return to the practice even after the days you abandoned it. You are building a retreat that is always available, a center that cannot be taken, a home inside yourself that exists regardless of what the outside world is doing. 6. The relationships that survive the transformation. We must speak honestly about what this path does to the people around you. Because it changes things. Not always in the ways you fear, but it changes things. As you become more grounded in yourself, as the solitude builds clarity, and the clarity builds boundaries, some relationships will naturally fall away. Not through conflict, not through cruelty, simply through the incompatibility that becomes visible when you stop performing the version of yourself those relationships were built around. This is disorienting. It can feel like loss. And in some cases, it is loss, genuine, painful loss of connections that felt significant. But the loss reveals something important. It reveals the difference between relationships built on dependency and relationships built on genuine alignment. And that difference matters more than you may yet understand. The connections that survive your transformation, that are still standing after the layers of performance have been stripped away, are different in quality from anything that came before. They are not built on what you can provide for each other's comfort or validation. They are built on something sturdier, shared values, mutual respect, the recognition of one grounded self by another. Seneca wrote, "Associate with those who will make you a better person. Welcome those who you yourself can improve. Not those who make you feel good in the moment, those who make you better over time." There is a profound difference. The first is easy to find. The second requires that you first know yourself well enough to recognize genuine growth when you encounter it, and that you be honest enough to offer it in return. This is what mastering yourself makes possible in relationship, not in vulnerability, not the cold, closed-off stance that mistake people make when they confuse strength with hardness, but genuine presence. The ability to show up for another person from a place of stability rather than need. To love without losing yourself. To connect without becoming entangled. To give without running empty. The paradox that most people never discover is this: the more fully you inhabit yourself, the more honest and complete your relationship with your own interior, the more genuinely you can inhabit your relationships with others. Because you are no longer using those relationships to do the work that only solitude can do. You are no longer reaching for other people to fill the space that only self-knowledge can fill. You come to your relationships whole, or at least more whole than before. And whole people build things together that incomplete people cannot. They build trust that is not dependent on performance, intimacy that is not dependent on agreement, love that is not dependent on the other person staying exactly as they are. 7. The person you become in the silence. We began with a moment, a quiet, ordinary, unremarkable moment, where the noise stopped just long enough for you to hear something underneath it, yourself. And we asked what you would choose in that moment, whether you would run back to the comfort of the crowd, the relief of distraction, the familiar blur of a life lived at the surface, or whether you would stay. Everything we have walked through, the practice of solitude, the honest examination of emotion, the daily discipline of returning, the discovery of bedrock beneath the performance, all of it points toward one thing: the person you become when you are willing to stay. Not the person the world shaped you into, not the person your fears have been building in secret, not the person assembled from other people's expectations and your own unexamined impulses. The person who exists on the other side of genuine self-examination, who has met themselves in the silence and not looked away, who has sat with the uncomfortable truth of their own unfinished nature and chosen deliberately and repeatedly to keep working. Epictetus, who had every external reason to be defeated by his circumstances and instead became one of the most influential minds in Western thought, said this: "No man is free who is not master of himself, not master of his circumstances, not master of other people or outcomes or the shifting tides of fortune, master of himself." That is the whole teaching, condensed to its irreducible core, and the path to it runs through the silence, through the solitude that most people run from, through the honest encounter with your own interior that feels threatening until it becomes the most important thing you have ever done. Marcus Aurelius spent years in private practice before anyone saw its results. Epictetus built his philosophy in conditions of powerlessness that would have broken most people. Seneca returned to these principles again and again across a life that included exile, wealth, loss, and the company of emperors. None of them arrived. None of them achieved a final, permanent, unassailable state of self-mastery from which they never again fell. They practiced, daily, imperfectly, with genuine commitment and inevitable failure and the consistent willingness to return. And that is what we are asking of ourselves. Not perfection, not transformation in a single dramatic moment, not the clean cinematic arc where the noise stops and the clarity arrives and everything is different from that point forward. Just the daily return to the practice, the morning willingness to go inward before going outward, the honest examination that takes place before the performing begins, the solitude that makes everything else possible. Because when you build that, when you build the habit of returning to yourself, of choosing the quiet over the crowd, of staying in the examination even when it is uncomfortable, something accumulates. Not quickly, not noisily, but with a certainty that grows more unshakable with every day you practice. You accumulate yourself, the real version, the grounded version, the version that does not need the noise because it has found something more reliable than noise, the version that does not need the crowd because it has learned to trust its own voice, the version that does not need constant motion because it has discovered that stillness is not emptiness. Stillness is where the work is done. Stillness is where the person you are capable of becoming is quietly, persistently, unmistakably built. I will leave you with this. Stay alone until you can hear your own thoughts without fear. Stay alone until the silence feels like strength and not punishment. Stay alone until you know the difference between what you want and what you have been told to want. Stay alone until solitude is not something you endure, but something you choose, deliberately, gratefully, as the most honest and essential practice available to you. And then, when you re-enter the world, and you will, and you should, because the work you do in solitude is ultimately in service of the life you live among others, you will bring something with you that nothing can take. A self, examined, grounded, real. The person who has mastered themselves does not need to announce it. They do not need to explain it or perform it or defend it. It is simply visible, in the steadiness of their presence, in the quality of their decisions, in the way they move through difficulty without being moved by it. That is what we are building, not in a single video, not in a single practice, but in the accumulated commitment of a life oriented inward, a life that takes its own interior seriously enough to examine it, a life that values truth over comfort and depth over noise. Seneca's final instruction to himself was this: retire into yourself as much as you can. We offer you the same, not as a retreat from life, as the preparation for it. Go inward, Stay there longer than feels comfortable. Build what only solitude can build. And trust that what you find there is worth the staying.